Imagine this. You're transported back, say, 2 centuries ago, walking through a German forest or field. You look inside a beehive. What you'd see is the native dark bee, Apis mellifera mellifera, the black German bee. Fast forward to today. Walk into almost any commercial apiary in Germany, and it's a totally different picture. It's almost certainly going to be Apis mellifera carnica, the Carnica bee.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? And we're not just talking about, a slight shift in preference. This is a story about a really profound institutional and genetic upheaval. It happened over about 150 years.
It's really reshaped thing.
Fundamentally, we're looking at a complete genetic displacement.
Exactly, and that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to unpack what happened roughly between 1830 and 1975. It's a mix of technological breakthroughs, pretty ambitious state policy, and definitely that post-war drive for economic yield. So our mission today is to trace the steps, look at the key people, the key decisions, from that invention of the movable frame hive right through to centralizing these mating stations, all leading to this non-native Carnica becoming the standard, pushing out the original dark bee.
And for you listening, the concept we really need to get our heads around is systematic genetic displacement. Because this wasn't just beekeepers trying something new, it was quite methodical, state-supported even.
Right.
Removing a native subspecies, the M-line bee, which was perfectly adapted to northern Europe, mind you, and replacing it with a non-native sea line bee, the Carnica, mainly because it was easier to manage industrially and gave, well, perceived higher yields.
So understanding that original bee and what was lost in terms of its specific adaptations, that's crucial to the whole story.
Absolutely. That specialized genetic resilience is key.
Okay, so let's start with that original resident, the one that was here first. Apis mellifera, the dark bee. Where did it come from and what made it so uniquely suited to Central and Northern Europe?
Right. So the dark bee, it belongs to what scientists call the M line. That's the phylogenetic M, or mellifera, evolutionary line. It's the bee lineage found furthest north and west in Europe.
Okay.
Its origins trace way back to the migrations after the last ice age. We're talking around 9000 BC. So it didn't just show up. It evolved here. It adapted really intimately to the Central European climate, especially as a forest dweller.
A forest dweller. Now that's interesting. What does that mean in terms of its diet? Because I think that specific adaptation is the crucial piece that gets lost later on, isn't it?
It's absolutely the defining feature, yes. You see, in many parts of Germany, particularly those forested mountain ranges, the main food source for bees in summer isn't always flower nectar. It's often Waltonic.
Forest honey.
Exactly, or honeydew. It's that sticky, sweet stuff secreted by aphids and other sap-sucking insects on trees. And the dark bee developed this unique genetic ability. It could eat this honeydew as its main winter food without getting seriously ill.
Why is that so special? I mean, can't other bees just eat honeydew too? What's the problem?
Well, honeydew is chemically very different from floral nectar. It has a much higher load of complex sugars that are hard to digest, and also minerals. Now, bees have this quirk. They don't defecate inside the hive.
Right. They hold it in until they can fly out, the cleansing flight.
Precisely. So imagine a bee trying to overwinter in a long, cold German winter, maybe confined for weeks, even months. If its diet is full of this indigestible stuff from honeydew, waste builds up in its rectum.
Ah, I see.
For many bee races, especially the sea lion bees, like the Italian or Carnica, this leads to fermentation, gut problems, a really nasty condition called dysentery, or Ruhr in German. It can wipe out colonies.
So if you were a beekeeper in one of those German regions, a Trachtgebiet, that relied heavily on forest forage, the native dark bee was just inherently more reliable. It had this built-in resistance.
Exactly right. That genetic adaptation, perfected over millennia to handle that difficult winter fuel efficiently. That was the dark bee's ecological superpower in those areas. So when the institutions later pushed for a foreign bee, they were, whether they fully realized the implications or not, effectively abandoning this fundamental specialized resistance.
Trading it for, what, easier handling?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Substituting it for traits that made human management easier, like gentleness or lower swarming. It's a classic trade-off. Specialized ecological resilience versus commercial convenience.
Now, this pressure on the native bee, it didn't just suddenly appear with the Carnica push, did it? Humans had been impacting wild bees for a long time before that.
Oh, absolutely. Humans have been exploiting wild honeybees for centuries. If you go back to the Middle Ages, you had the Zeidlerei, forest beekeeping.
Right, cutting combs out of trees.
Yeah, basically harvesting honey and wax, sometimes taking the whole colony from natural tree hollows or log hives, clots butane, and that was certainly destructive locally. It could wipe out individual colonies.
But it wasn't systematic displacement.
No, exactly. It put pressure on population. Sure, it fragmented things, but it was decentralized. It lacked the infrastructure the organization needed for the kind of total decisive genetic standardization we see emerging in the 19th and especially the 20th century.
Okay, so what did provide that technical infrastructure? That seems like the perfect place to bring in the big game changer, the name that really revolutionized beekeeping. Farrer Dr. Johann Dzierzon.
Dzierzon, yes. Born 1811, died 1906. A Silesian priest, he's rightly called the founder of the new German beekeeping. He really professionalized what was often just a hobby and brought scientific rigor to it. His key contribution wasn't breeding, though. It was the tool.
The movable comb hive.
The movable comb seems so basic to us now, but its impact was immense.
Explain that. Why was this simple invention, the movable frame, so utterly indispensable, unabdingbar for the kind of standardization that came later?
Well, think about beekeeping before Dzierzon. You had fixed comb hives, those log hives, straw-skeps. You couldn't really see what was going on inside without basically destroying the comb structure, upsetting the whole colony.
So inspecting the queen, checking honey stores, drone levels, it was all disruptive guesswork.
Total disruption. You often had to kill the colony to harvest properly. It was inherently limiting for any kind of systematic study or, crucially, systematic intervention.
Okay.
Dzierzon figured out the bee space that gap bees naturally leave between combs. He designed frames that could be slid in and out, respecting that space, like files in a filing cabinet.
Right.
And Dzierzon himself had this incredible knack for observation and deduction, what was called his höchst seltenen Beobachtungs- und Kombinationsgabe, his rare gift for observation and combination. This setup allowed him to study things like parthenogenesis in drones, sex ratios, inheritance, systematically for the first time ever.
So that's the link. If you can finally see inside, observe systematically, then you can start to control systematically. Control breeding, control genetics.
Precisely. The movable comb was the absolute technical prerequisite for managing genetics on a large scale. You simply cannot do controlled systematic breeding, selecting queens, controlling mating if you can't access individual frames, track lineages, assess colony traits without tearing everything apart.
So no Dzierzon frame, no mass establishment of a standardized breed like Carnica later on. It just wouldn't have been feasible.
Logistically impossible on that scale, yes. It enabled the very idea of industrial-scale bee breeding.
It's interesting, though. You mentioned Dzierzon's focus was scientific discovery. He believed science was universal, communal property.
Yeah, he was very much an Enlightenment figure in that sense. He published openly, wanted to share knowledge. His philosophy was about advancing understanding for everyone.
But then, just a few decades later, his very practical, open technology gets co-opted, essentially, for a much narrower purpose.
Exactly. It gets taken up and implemented within these centralized, often nationalistic, state-driven policies. The Rassenpolitik, the racial policy for bees, which were all about enforcing genetic purity and standardization within borders, primarily for economic gain.
So the tool was neutral science, but the application became strategic and nationalistic.
A stark contrast, yes. The innovation was open, the implementation became closed and strategic.
Okay, Dzierzon provides the tools. Now, the German beekeeping world had the means to really control breeding, but what should they breed? The first big push wasn't for Carnica, was it? It was for another import, the Italian bee. And this brings in Gustave de Day.
Right, Gustave de, the active mid-19th century, he's a really key figure because he's the one who properly established the idea and demonstrated that bringing in foreign bee genetics could offer real commercial advantages. He kind of broke the taboo against messing with the native bee.
And he wasn't pushing Carnica yet. His focus was crossing the native German dark bee with Apis mellifera ligustica, the Italian bee. He even wrote a guide, Anleitung zum Italisieren, instructions on Italianizing. What was the appeal of the Italian bee back then?
Oh, ligustica had, and still has, some fantastic commercial traits on paper. It's known for being exceptionally gentle, very active, builds up large populations quickly, and stores huge amounts of honey. Plus, they look different. They have that characteristic bright yellow abdomen, unlike the dark native bee.
So for a beekeeper wanting bigger harvests and easier handling, it sounded perfect.
Absolutely. It promised a potential revolution in manageability and yield.
And even though Doth's work involved hybridization, which diluted the native genes, it did something crucial psychologically, didn't it? It kind of prepared the ground.
It absolutely did. It established a critical precedent. Before Doth, the native bee was just the bee. the default.
Yeah.
After Doth successfully promoted these Italian crosses, the mindset began to shift. Genetics started to be seen more like a toolkit.
If a foreign tool gives better economic results, maybe we should use it.
That was the thinking that took hold. Commercial traits could potentially trump nativity. It proved the concept, even if this specific bee wasn't the final answer.
Right, because the Italian bee ultimately failed to take over in Germany despite that initial promise. Why did it fail? Because understanding this failure is arguably super important for why Carnica eventually succeeded.
The failure of ligustica in Germany is a powerful lesson. It's all about ecological adaptation. The Italian bee, ligustica, it's a sea lion bee. It evolved in warm Mediterranean climates. Its biology, its whole rhythm is tuned for that.
Okay, so what's its strategy in a warm climate? How does it manage its brood, its young?
Its strategy is basically keep going, continuous intensive brood rearing pretty much all year round. In the Mediterranean, where winters are mild and forage might get scarce but rarely disappears completely for months on end, this works brilliantly.
Keeps the population strong, ready to go when flowers bloom.
Exactly. It allows them to ramp up fast whenever there's food available. It's a great strategy for a long, relatively gentle season.
But Germany has proper winters. Long, cold winters. Unpredictable springs sometimes, too. What happens when a ligustica colony tries to run that same continuous brooding strategy in, say, Bavaria or the Black Forest?
There's a recipe for disaster. They keep raising huge amounts of brood deep into the autumn and start up again very early in spring, sometimes even during winter warm spells. Raising brood takes a massive amount of resources. Pollen for protein, honey for energy.
So they're burning through their winter stores.
They burn through them at an alarming rate. If there's a long cold snap or a wet cold spring where they can't fly to forage for weeks, the hive literally eats itself into starvation. They just don't have the instinct to conserve resources effectively for a long, harsh winter brood pause or brood break.
It's like trying to run a marathon on a sprinter's energy plan, a fundamental mismatch in resource management.
That's a great way to put it. This led to a really inefficient winter economy inside the hive. Beekeepers who tried large-scale Italianizing saw unacceptably high winter losses. They learned the hard way. A bee optimized for Naples just doesn't work reliably in Hamburg or Munich.
Okay, so the ligustica failure really hammered home the requirements for the next potential import. It wasn't enough for it to be gentle and productive.
No, it absolutely had to have that crucial trait, pronounced winter rest. It needed to know how to shut down brood rearing, form a tight winter cluster, and be incredibly thrifty with its stores to survive those long, cold, foodless periods.
But still productive in summer.
Yes. That was the holy grail, high yield potential plus excellent winter hardiness and resource conservation. And those traits. They were found perfectly embodied in another sea lion bee, one adapted to harsh alpine conditions, the Carnica.
So the failure of the Italian bee directly paved the way for the Carnica because the Carnica had the wintering ability the Italian bee lacked.
Exactly. The German beekeeping community learned a costly but vital biological lesson. Climate adaptation trumps everything else for survival. Convenience and yield are useless if the bees don't make it through the winter. They needed a bee that could handle the German climate. The Carnica seemed to fit the bill.
Right, the lessons learned, the technology Dzierzon's frames is there. Now we enter the phase where it gets organized, where state institutions really start to step in and push the selection of the Carnica. This kicks off seriously in the 1930s, doesn't it?
Yes, the 1930s are pivotal for institutionalizing this. The key organizational move was the creation of the Reichsfachgruppe Imker, the RfgI, in 1934. This body essentially centralized control over beekeeping nationwide.
Taking power away from local clubs.
Pretty much. Decision-making shifted to this central authority, and this structure was absolutely essential for implementing any kind of standardized Rasenpolitik or racial policy for bees across the country. You need central control to enforce standardization.
And there were influential figures pushing this, people like the Freudensteins.
Heinrich and Karl Freudenstein, yes. They were key experts whose thinking really shaped the discourse, heavily prioritizing efficiency, manageability, and commercial output.
So what was the official strategy at first? Did they just ban the dark bee?
Not immediately, no. On paper, the RfgI implemented what they called a dual Rassen strategy, a two-race strategy. They actually designated specific regions for pure breeding of the native dark bee, the N strains.
And for Nordbean, presumably?
Likely, or just native. And other regions were designated for the Carnica, the K strains. So officially, they were acknowledging the native bee's adaptation.
Okay, if the dark bee was still officially recognized, How did the system get so heavily biased towards the Carnica in practice? What was the mechanism?
Resources. It came down to where the state put its money and its organizational muscle. The really crucial move was the massive state investment in establishing and controlling the Belegstellen, these isolated mating stations, specifically for Carnica pure breeding.
Ah, the mating stations again.
Yes. By pouring resources into Carnica mating stations, the state apparatus was effectively legitimizing the non-native bee as the preferred commercial standard. They were providing the critical infrastructure needed to maintain its genetic purity and facilitate its spread.
So it wasn't an outright ban, but a kind of strategic neglect of the dark bees infrastructure while actively building up the Carnicas.
Precisely. In centralized animal breeding, controlling the breeding infrastructure is control. The state was essentially saying, we will help you produce purebred Carnica queens easily and reliably. That created a huge economic incentive for beekeepers to switch. It made sticking with the dark bee much harder, more fragmented, and less supported.
And the specific type of Carnica that became the foundation in Germany, that came from Austria, didn't it? From Guido Sklenar.
Yes, the specific genetic material that really anchored the Carnica takeover in Germany was the Sklenar strain, developed by the Austrian breeder Guido Sklenar. His bees became the model.
So what were the exact traits they were selecting for in this Sklenar Carnica? What made it the ideal commercial phenotype they were aiming for?
They were laser-focused on breeding out the perceived weaknesses of the traditional dark bee. Primarily, its reputation for being, well, somewhat defensive at times, and its strong tendency to swarm.
Right.
So the goals for the Carnica were crystal clear and all about human convenience and maximizing yield potential through colony stability. Number 1, sanftmütig, gentle, docile, easy to handle. Number 2, Wabenstedt, quiet on the comb, meaning the bees don't run around frantically when you open the hive.
Makes inspections easier.
Much easier. Number 3, leistungsstark, high performance, meaning good honey production. And number 4, perhaps the most important commercially, Schwarmtrage.
Low swarming tendency. Let's pause on that one. Schwarmtrage. Why is minimizing swarming so incredibly important from an economic perspective? Important enough to justify replacing a native bee?
Swarming is natural reproduction for a bee colony. But for a commercial beekeeper, it's a potential disaster. When a colony prepares to swarm, it invests huge resources in raising new queen cells. Then, the old queen leaves with roughly half the worker bees.
Half your workforce gone right in the middle of the honey flow sometime.
Exactly. You instantly lose half your honey gathering potential for that hive for the rest of the season. Plus, you have the hassle of catching the swarm, requeening the old hive.
Right.
It's a massive labor cost and a huge hit to productivity.
So if you're managing hundreds or even thousands of hives, controlling swarming is maybe the single biggest challenge.
It's the defining bottleneck of large-scale traditional beekeeping. The native dark bee was known for being quite swarm-prone, which makes sense ecologically for dispersal, but it's a nightmare commercially.
Okay.
By selecting relentlessly for a swarm-trade bee like the Carnica, they enabled beekeepers to maintain much larger, more stable colonies throughout the season. More bees in the box means more honey, less swarming means less labor, and more predictable yields.
So it allowed for a more industrialized, predictable form of beekeeping.
Precisely. It wasn't just about the peak honey potential of an individual bee, perhaps, but about the overall efficiency and scalability of the system. The Carnica was being engineered as the perfect bee for modern, large-scale apiary management, a reliable workhorse.
Less about adapting the management to the bee, more about adapting the bee to the management.
That's a very good way to put it. It prioritized human control and predictability over the bee's wilder, more ecologically tuned instincts.
But you mentioned a nuance earlier, that even these highly selected Sklenar Carnicas weren't always perfectly docile. Some reports said they could still be quite defensive.
Yes, that's an important point. There were definitely reports, even from proponents, that some purebred Sklenar lines could be among the biggest stingers. It wasn't that Carnica was inherently always gentle.
So what does that tell us?
It underscores that its success, particularly regarding traits like gentleness and low swarming, was really a triumph of relentless selection pressure and consistent management, not necessarily some magical inherent biological property.
They bred the traits they wanted into dominance.
Exactly. They hadn't eliminated the genes for defensiveness or swarming entirely, but they had suppressed them through generations of highly focused, industrialized breeding. The institutions succeeded because they produced a bee that was manageable enough consistently enough to meet the demands of the commercial standard they were creating.
Okay, so the ideal phenotype is defined, the Sklenar strain is available, the state infrastructure is leaning heavily towards Carnica. Now we enter the final phase, the genetic purge, really. This accelerates massively after World War II, doesn't it? Driven by the need for economic recovery.
Yes, the period from the 1950s through the mid-1970s is really the point of no return for the native dark bee in Germany. This phase is marked by one critical, decisive administrative action: the complete conversion of essentially all the state-controlled pure breeding stations, the Reinzuchtbelegstellen, away from the dark bee and entirely over to the Carnica.
Okay, we really need to unpack this because it sounds administrative, but you're saying this was the genetic catastrophe. How could converting just these isolated stations basically wipe out the native gene pool across the whole country? What's the genetic mechanism here?
It's all about controlling the drones. Remember, these Belegstellen are set up in deliberately isolated places, remote islands, high mountain valleys, precisely to control mating.
To keep out unwanted drones.
Exactly. A virgin queen bee flies out on mating flights, and she'll mate with multiple drones, maybe 10, 15, even 20, high up in the air in what are called drone congregation areas. To ensure your queen mates only with drones of your chosen purebred line, you have to saturate the airspace around the Belegstell with those specific drones.
So the station floods the local area with purebred drones from its selected colonies.
Correct. They maintain numerous drone mother colonies of the desired strain. Now, here's the catastrophic part for the dark bee. When the authorities decided systematically to convert all these crucial state-sanctioned mating stations exclusively to Carnica.
They flooded the mating zones across Germany with Carnica drones.
Precisely. So any beekeeper may be miles away trying desperately to maintain their pure line of native dark bees when their virgin dark bee queen flew out to mate.
She couldn't find any pure dark bee drones, or very few.
She was overwhelmingly likely to encounter and mate with the now dominant Carnica drones flying from or descended from colonies near these official stations. Drones can fly quite far, several kilometers, effectively contaminating the regional drone pool.
And the offspring.
Instant hybrids, F1 crosses. From a genetic conservation standpoint, that's the end of the pure native line in that area. The beekeepers didn't have to actively kill their dark bees. The institutions just had to control the mating sites. It made pure breeding of the dark bee practically impossible for the average keeper outside of incredibly specialized private isolation efforts.
It was genetic replacement by controlling reproduction, an administratively enforced bottleneck.
Absolutely. The state effectively withdrew the essential infrastructure needed to maintain the M-line's genetic integrity, condemning it to hybridization and eventual disappearance from the mainstream.
And the driving force behind this final decisive push in the 50s and 60s was economics, post-war recovery.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The post-war decades in Germany were all about rebuilding, efficiency, maximizing output in every sector, including agriculture. The Carnica bee was perceived and heavily promoted as offering higher, more reliable honey yields.
Predictability was key.
Predictability and standardization were paramount. The Carnica fit perfectly into the industrial, standardized model of agriculture that was taking hold everywhere. Reliability was seen as an essential economic virtue.
And the scientific institutions, the Bee Institute, the beekeeping associations, they carry a heavy responsibility here, don't they? They were the advisors, the implementers.
They absolutely do bear the primary institutional responsibility. They were the architects and facilitators of this shift. Crucially, many experts knew about the dark bee's unique ecological advantages, like that forest honey resistance we talked about.
But they didn't fight to keep it.
They failed to effectively advocate for, or secure funding for, robust parallel breeding programs for the native bee. It seems the institutional preference for uniformity, the sheer administrative simplicity of managing just one standard breed across the country, won out over the long-term value of genetic diversity and specialized ecological adaptation.
It sounds like a classic case of prioritizing short-term manageable uniformity over complex long-term resilience, choosing the perceived easy path.
That's a fair assessment, I think. It prioritized the needs of the management system over the inherent adaptations of the organism.
So this idea that Carnica was just flat out biologically superior everywhere in Germany, was that actually true? What did later scientific comparisons show?
This is where it gets really interesting, the scientific relativization of that superiority narrative. Later comparative research, especially the meticulous work done by people like Professor Friedrich Rotner and his colleagues like Fehrenbach, really challenged that simple idea.
Rotner. A big name in bee genetics. What did their studies involve? How did they compare the bees?
Rutner was arguably the leading bee geneticist of the latter 20th century. Their studies were often comparative trials. They'd take colonies of different races, Carnica, the remnant dark bee, mellifera, and often the hybrid buckfast bee as well, and place them side by side in the same apiary, under identical management, but across different locations in Germany.
Controlling for management, varying the environment.
Exactly. They'd measure everything. How quickly the colonies built up in spring, their swarming behavior, disease resistance, temperament, and critically, their honey production.
And what was the big takeaway from these careful side-by-side comparisons?
The results were quite striking. They consistently found that the location, meaning the specific local climate, the timing and type of forage available, the microgeography had a significantly greater impact on how well a colony performed, especially its honey yield, than its genetic origin, whether it was Carnica or mellifera.
Wow. So it wasn't so much about which bee you had, but where you had it.
That was the crucial finding. In certain locations, especially those with significant forest honey flows or unpredictable spring weather, the native dark bee often performed just as well as, and sometimes even better than, the Carnica.
So the idea of universal Carnica superiority was maybe more marketing and institutional momentum than pure biological fact?
The conclusion Rutner and others drew was essentially that, yes, the Carnica's ultimate triumph in Germany wasn't necessarily because it was intrinsically biologically superior every single German environment. Its victory was more a result of a highly successful, centrally organized and enforced breeding strategy, heavily reliant on those Belegstellen, which provided the standardization and reliability that the institutions and large-scale management systems valued above all else.
It's a powerful example of how standardization, enforced institutionally, can create its own success, regardless of nuanced local realities.
Precisely. It showcases the sheer power of infrastructure and policy in shaping the genetic landscape in modern animal husbandry.
Okay, so the Carnica wins. It's established, dominant, thanks to this whole process. Which leads us to a really weird situation today, a kind of paradox in German law and common parlance. The Carnica is often called einheimische native, even though we've just spent all this time explaining how it displaced the actual indigenous bee, Apipus mellifera. How does that work?
It's a fascinating and slightly bizarre example of how legal or administrative definitions can completely diverge from biological reality. Scientifically speaking, indigenous or autochthonous means the organism evolved naturally in that specific region over evolutionary time.
Which is the dark bee.
Unquestionably, the dark bee, the M-line, is the indigenous honeybee of Germany. The Carnica, imported from the Alpine regions, selected heavily from the 1930s onwards. It's clearly not indigenous in the biological sense.
So where does the native label for Carnica come from legally?
It comes from the German Animal Breeding Act, the Tierschutzgesetz, or Tierschutzgesetz. This law defines native livestock, einheimische Nutztierrasse, based on criteria that are more about tradition and time than strict biological origin.
What are the criteria?
Essentially, if a breed has been kept and bred in Germany for a significant period, often interpreted as over 100 years, and is considered part of the traditional agricultural landscape, it can qualify for this native designation under the law.
The 100-year rule. So, because the Sklenar Carnica strain was introduced in the 1930s and has been the dominant commercial bee for decades since, it's simply been here long enough to be grandfathered in as legally native.
That's pretty much it. It achieves this naturalized status through historical inertia and its established economic importance. The legal definition effectively legitimizes the outcome of that historical displacement process. It enshrines the status quo.
And this legal quirk, classifying the commercially dominant import as native, must have real consequences, especially for efforts to conserve the actual native bee.
Oh, the consequences are huge. The original indigenous dark bee, A.M. mellifera, is now considered critically endangered in Germany. There are dedicated conservation groups like the Nordbean Initiative and others working incredibly hard to find and protect the last remaining pockets of pure M-line genetics.
But if the Carnica is also legally native, where does the official support, the funding, tend to go?
That's exactly the problem. This legal classification creates a potential bias. Scarce conservation funding, political attention, institutional support. It can easily end up being directed primarily towards the C-line Carnica, which is already commercially dominant and secure, simply because it holds that native livestock status legally.
So it could actually hinder the efforts to save the genuinely endangered indigenous bee.
It absolutely risks doing that. It creates a situation where the administrative definition, born out of historical economic choices, actively disadvantages the conservation of the biologically native and now threatened organism.
Wow. It really shows how choices made decades ago for economic reasons get locked in by legal frameworks, perpetuating the very imbalance that caused the problem. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. How does this whole German story, this displacement, fit into the bigger global picture of beekeeping? Is this kind of standardization common elsewhere?
The German experience is sadly quite representative of a global trend. We know of about 33 distinct subspecies of the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, around the world, each adapted to its local environment.
But only a few dominate commercially.
Exactly. A tiny handful of highly selected, standardized commercial lines account for the vast majority of managed honey production worldwide. It's a massive global bottleneck, driven by the same pressures for yield, manageability, and ease of transport. Commercial standardization tends to push out local diversity everywhere.
So let's quickly recap the big global players. We know Carnica dominates Central Europe.
Yes, the Carnica sea lion is king in Germany, Austria, much of Eastern Europe. And interestingly, it's also very popular in places like Norway, precisely because its alpine adaptation gives it that excellent wintering ability and resource efficiency needed for strong seasonal climates.
Okay. And the Italian bee, ligustica, the one that failed in Germany.
Globally, it's a huge success story, but primarily in warm climates. It's dominant in the US, Australia, South America, parts of Southern Europe. Beekeepers there value it for exactly the traits that cause problems in Germany. Its gentleness and relentless productivity in environments with long, warm seasons and consistent forage.
Then there's the hybrid, the buckfast bee.
The buckfast is fascinating. Developed over decades by Brother Adam at Buckfast Abbey in the UK, it's not a pure subspecies, but a complex, deliberate hybrid combining genetics from many different lines. It was bred specifically for traits like robustness, disease resistance, productivity, and crucially, extremely low swarming tendency.
A kind of best of all worlds approach.
That was the goal, and it's increasingly popular worldwide as a pragmatic, highly adaptable commercial option, often further displacing more specialized local bees.
And finally, the original dark bee, the M line, mellifera. Where does it survive today if it's been largely pushed out of places like Germany?
Its survival is largely thanks to dedicated conservation efforts in specific regions. While nearly gone from Germany and much of France, significant populations are being conserved in parts of Northern Europe, think Ireland, the native Irish honeybee, parts of the UK, Scandinavia, often called the Nordic brown bee, and pockets in France and Switzerland.
So groups fighting the same battle that was lost in Germany decades ago.
Essentially, yes. They are trying to preserve those unique, locally adapted M-line genetics against the tide of commercial standardization, arguing for the value of specialized resilience over uniform, easy-to-manage productivity.
So the German story really does mirror this larger global conflict. The drive for high performance and industrial scale management, especially low swarming, often winning out over maintaining the rich tapestry of indigenous genetic diversity and its specialized adaptations.
It's a classic tension in modern agriculture, and the honeybee is a prime example. #take outro. So if we were to synthesize this whole dramatic story of how the Carnica took over in Germany, it really happened in distinct stages. First, you had Dzierzon's invention, the movable comb, providing the essential technical means for genetic control.
The tool.
The tool, exactly. Second, Data's experiments with the Italian bees psychologically opened the door to using foreign genetics. But the critical failure of ligustica due to climate mismatch highlighted the absolute need for strong wintering ability.
Setting the stage for Carnica.
Precisely. Third, you had the centralized institutions, like the RfgI in the 30s, making a deliberate choice, adopting the Sklenar Carnica strain, and systematically selecting for that ideal commercial phenotype, gentle and especially low swarming.
Institutionalizing the preference.
Yes, and then the fourth final stage, the post-war economic drive, which led to the decisive systematic conversion of all the crucial state-controlled mating stations, the Belegstellen, exclusively to Carnica in the 50s and 60s. That was the knockout blow for the native dark bee's genetic integrity on a national scale.
Enforcing uniformity through controlling reproduction, it really crystallizes that central conflict we've been talking about, the push for commercial uniformity versus valuing specialized local ecological adaptation.
It really does. It stands as one of the most, stark and compelling examples of how intensive human management, driven by economic goals and enabled by technology and policy, can completely rewrite the genetic makeup of an entire managed animal population in a relatively short time.
It's an incredible story. And maybe as a final thought, let's circle back to that one very specific, unique trait that was largely sacrificed in this process. The dark bee's genetic resistance to dysentery when consuming forest honey, the Waldhonig. That incredible adaptation, honed over thousands of years.
Yeah, that was traded away for standardized reliability and ease of handling.
Which leaves us with a provocative question for you, the listener, to think about.
What is the real long-term cost, perhaps a non-economic cost, of sacrificing that kind of highly specialized indigenous genetic resilience?
As we look ahead to a future that seems likely to involve more environmental uncertainty, changing climates, new diseases, shifts in flowering patterns, and maybe even forest health, does relying so heavily on a single standardized genetic line, even a good one, potentially reduce our collective resilience? Is a more uniform population, one that lacks those deep, localized adaptations, really built to withstand the unexpected challenges that are inevitably coming down the road? That tension between standardization today and adaptability tomorrow, it's definitely something worth mulling over.